The pain had stopped being something I could narrate. I had tried, at the beginning. In the early hours of Thursday evening, when the contractions were still far enough apart to breathe between, I had been composing sentences about what it felt like, the pressure, the build, the specific geography of it. By the time the taxi dropped me at the entrance to Meridian General, the sentences had dissolved. There was only the body and what the body was doing, and the narrowing of the world to the immediate task. I checked myself in alone. I had arranged for this a patient advocate on file, a birth plan submitted 3 weeks prior, a note in my records that listed no emergency contacts, because I had decided that the person who would be contacted in an emergency was me, and I would be present. The delivery suite was on the 4th floor. The nurse who took me up was calm and efficient, which was what I needed. Her name was Colette. She had the quality of someone who had seen most things and was not rattled by any of them, which was also what I needed. My name is Milo Vance. I was 26, a structural engineer, and I was giving birth to triplets alone on a Thursday night because I had made a decision 9 months ago that I was going to do this the way I had done everything in those 9 months, by myself, correctly, without calling anyone. The monitor registered the contractions in peaks and valleys. Colette checked my dilation. The attending was in emergency surgery and had been paged. I focused on the ceiling tile and I breathed. The door opened, and the room changed. Not visibly. The lights held. The monitors continued their work. But the air shifted a density, a pressure, the quality of space that has been entered by a presence that takes up more than its dimensions. 3 scents arrived simultaneously. Dark amber and cedar, cold iron and pine, warm wood smoke and something sharper underneath, like ozone before lightning. I had spent 9 months building a container around my knowledge of those 3 scents. The container held for approximately 4 seconds after the door opened. Then, the pack recognition dormant, stretched thin, weakened by distance and deliberate suppression detonated quietly in my chest like something that had been waiting for exactly this. I turned my head. All 3 of them were in the doorway. Not together by plan, I would understand this later. Colette had paged the on-call OB, which was Coulson. The on-call OB's attending backup was Emmett, the hospital's chief of obstetrics, who had been in his office when the page came through and had come down because the case file indicated triplets at 36 weeks, and he reviewed all complex deliveries personally. Emile, the neonatology attending on call tonight, had been alerted separately triplet birth, possible NICU requirement, standard protocol. 3 separate pages, 3 separate reasons. 1 room. The universe had a specific sense of the dramatic. Coulson was reading the chart. Emmett was behind him, slightly to the left, his attention on the monitor readout over the door. Emile was last, still pulling on his second glove, and he looked up before the other 2 did. Emile saw me first. He went completely still. The glove was half on. He stood in the doorway with one hand ungloved and the other half covered, and his face, Emile, who had always been the one whose face said what he felt before he could manage it, showed everything at once. Shock, then recognition, then something that was not quite grief but lived in the same territory. Coulson looked up from the chart. He stopped reading. The chart lowered in his hand by approximately 3 inches. His jaw moved once. He looked at my face, then at my abdomen, then back at my face, with the specific horror of a man arriving somewhere he did not expect and understanding all at once what his arrival means. Emmett was last. He had been looking at the monitor, and when he turned to the bed and saw me, his expression did the thing. Emmett's expressions never did. It became uncontrolled, just for a moment. A fracture in the composure he had spent 34 years perfecting. Then, all 3 of them were standing in the room looking at me, and the monitor beside me registered my heart rate spiking in a rapid series of ascending beeps. I said, "This is a medical situation. You're all here professionally, or you're not here at all." My voice was level. I was extremely proud of this. Coulson moved first. He was the OB on call, and whatever else was happening in that room, he understood what his job was. He set the chart down, checked the monitor, looked at Colette with the focused efficiency of a physician who has made a decision. He said, "Current dilation?" Colette said, 9 centimeters. First presentation is vertex. She glanced between us with the professional neutrality of someone who had assessed the situation and decided that her job was to support the clinical process and not the interpersonal catastrophe. Do your jobs or get out of my room. Those are the options. Emmett took a step toward the bed. Milo. His voice was the voice of a man who had been rehearsing apologies for 9 months and was discovering that none of them were available to him right now. Not now, I said. After. Do your jobs. He stopped walking. He closed his mouth. Coulson took the stool at the foot of the bed. Emil moved to the warmer on the right side of the room, the neonatology station, where the equipment for receiving newborns was already arranged, and finished putting on his second glove without looking at me. His hands were shaking slightly. He controlled them by the time he reached the warmer. Emmett stood near the door with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated and said nothing, because he understood, correctly, that his role right now was oversight and presence and not the conversation he wanted to have. The labor lasted 4 hours and 50 minutes from the moment they walked in. Coulson was brilliant. This was not new information. I had known he was brilliant before any of this. Had loved him partly because of the specific way his intelligence operated, the precision of it, the absence of ego and how he used it. In the delivery room, he was everything a physician was supposed to be. Focused, calm, efficient, capable of communicating the exact amount of information needed and nothing more. He spoke to me by name. He did not pretend we were strangers. He did not perform clinical detachment in a way that erased the reality of the room. He simply did what was in front of him to do with the skill that he had spent years building, and I held on to that as an anchor, not because it meant anything had changed between us, but because it meant I was in good hands, and right now, that was sufficient. The first delivery was straightforward. Sol arrived at 40 minutes in, dark-haired, furious, immediately vocal about his opinions on the matter. Emil received him at the warmer with hands that were completely steady by then, and I watched my son's first seconds of life from across the room while Colette monitored my vitals and Emmett stood near the door watching all of it with an expression I chose not to examine. The second delivery was harder. Ren came posterior and required repositioning. 12 seconds of tense silence in the room. Coulson's hands and judgment and voice saying, "Stay with me, Milo. Stay focused." And I stayed focused because I had been staying focused for 9 months and I knew how to do it. When Ren cried, it was a different sound than Sol lower, more considered, as if he was already deciding whether the world warranted the noise. Emil took him to the second warmer. Emmett crossed the room to look at him and then stopped himself and went back to the wall. The third delivery was the hardest. Rue arrived at 4 hours and 40 minutes, small and briefly silent, and in the silence between his birth and his first breath, the room became a different kind of place, the clinical machinery of it stripped away. Just 4 people and 1 new person, and the specific terror of waiting. Coulson worked. Emil appeared beside him at the warmer, and the two of them together, brothers, physicians, men who had walked out of my life 9 months ago and were now working in coordinated silence to make sure my son lived, were the most competent and most painful thing I had watched in a long time. Rue cried. The sound that came out of me was not a word. I lay back and closed my eyes and held the 10 seconds I always allowed myself 10 seconds to be completely undone before the container reassembled. Then, I opened my eyes. Emil was holding Rue with the focused gentleness of a neonatologist assessing a newborn, running the checks, noting the scores. His face over the baby was the face of a professional doing his job, but his hands were doing something that was not professional. They were holding that baby the way you held something you had not known existed until 30 seconds ago and already could not imagine not knowing. Coulson came to stand beside the bed. He had removed his gloves. He was not performing anything. He looked at me with the specific exhaustion of someone who had spent 4 hours and 50 minutes being excellent at his job while something else entirely was happening in the same room. He said, "You did it." I said, "I did it 9 months ago too, without any of you." He received that without deflecting. I said, "You can go write your notes. Send Emil in with the babies when he's done." He said, "Milo." I said, "Not tonight, Coulson. Tonight is theirs." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded and went to write his notes. Emmett approached the bed. He stopped at what he had calculated was a respectful distance, close enough to speak, far enough to not impose. He said, "They're healthy, all 3. The scores are good. I said, I know. I read the monitor. He said, I know you did. We looked at each other. He said, I don't know how to start. I said, then don't. Not tonight. He looked at the three warmers. At three small people who had not existed in the world this morning and now did, at what 9 months of his absence had produced. He said, Are they? I said, Yes. He already knew. The pack biology of it was not a question. But he needed to hear it, and I was not cruel enough to make him ask more precisely. He nodded. He said, Thank you for letting us be here. I said, You were paged. You didn't need my permission. He said, That's not what I meant. I knew it wasn't what he meant. I said, Go check on your brothers. Send someone in with my sons. He went. Colette brought Sol to me first, and then Ren, and then Emile came himself with Rue, the last one, the smallest, the one who had been quiet for 5 seconds that had lasted a lifetime. Emile stood beside the bed holding my son and looked at me. His name is on the intake form, he said. Rue. Yes. That's a good name. I know. He looked at Rue in his arms. He adjusted his hold, a small, automatic neonatologist gesture, checking weight distribution. Then he stopped doing it clinically and just held him. I didn't know, he said, very quietly. I know you didn't. He kept his eyes on the baby. I'm not saying it as an excuse. I'm saying it because it's true and because I think you should know what I knew and when. I know what you knew. You knew I was pregnant. The rest is something I made the decision to handle alone. He looked up then. Give him to me. He placed Rue in my arms with the careful precision of a neonatologist who understood exactly how to transfer a newborn, and also with something else, the care of a man handing back something he understood was not his to keep. I held all three of them in sequence and said their names to each of them and let the room be what it was. Then I told Colette to let me sleep. 3 days. I had the standard recovery period for a triplet birth without surgical complication, and I organized those 3 days with the thoroughness I brought to everything. Feeding schedules. The NICU monitoring for all 3 boys healthy, above threshold, precautionary observation only, discharge planning. The specific logistics of transporting 3 infants to an apartment that had been prepared for this moment for 6 weeks. Petra was in the waiting room for all 3 days. She brought food and supplies and the kind of friendship that did not require words or reassurance, just presence and protein. On the second afternoon, she held Ren for 3 hours while I slept, and when I woke up, she had reorganized the feeding schedule on my phone in a way that was marginally more efficient than my version, which I acknowledged without saying anything because it would have pleased her too much. Dax came on the second day, ate lunch with me, talked about a structural problem at the firm, received my feedback on it, and left. Normal. Grounding. Exactly right. The 3 alphas did not come to my room. Not because I had forbidden it, I had not. I had said nothing either way, which meant the decision was theirs to make, and they made it correctly. They understood, without being told, that arriving at my room uninvited the day after the delivery would be wrong. This was progress of a kind, though I was not prepared to call it that yet. What they did instead? Coulson documented the births with the meticulous accuracy of a physician who understood that records were permanent and made sure that everything about the delivery was correct on paper. He sent a message through the hospital system on the evening of the first day that said, all 3 are tracking well, growth curves are normal, night team has your care preferences on file. Let me know if anything needs adjusting. Clinical, functional, appropriate. Emmett appeared at the NICU window on the morning of the second day. I saw him from the corridor when Colette walked me past for the morning feed. He was in his white coat, chief of obstetrics, his name on the lanyard. The institutional authority of the hospital arranged around him, and he was standing at the glass, looking at 3 bassinets with the expression of a man who had made a decision he believed was correct and was now standing in the wreckage of it. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to the nursing station and asked which room I was in. The nurse said, Mr. Vance has requested that visitors outside his listed contacts be redirected to the patient advocate's office. Emmett said something I couldn't hear. She shook her head politely. He was the chief of obstetrics, and she was a nurse doing her job, and she did not waver, which told me something about the culture Emmett had built in this department. He had apparently trained people to follow protocol regardless of rank. He went back to the NICU corridor and sat in the chair outside it and did not leave. Emil arrived an hour later in his neonatology coat, which gave him legitimate access to the NICU floor on professional grounds, and he used that access to stand at his brother's side in the corridor rather than to push for anything he hadn't been given. He sat 2 chairs away from Emmett. They did not speak to each other. They stayed. On the morning of the 3rd day, Emmett sent a letter through the hospital's formal communication system. Legal letterhead, he had drafted it, I suspected, the night before while sitting in that corridor chair. It said, "We are requesting formal acknowledgement on the birth records as biological fathers and an opportunity to discuss co-parenting terms at a time of your choosing and convenience. We understand you have no obligation to accommodate this request immediately or at all. We are requesting nonetheless, through whatever channel you designate." Signed, Emmett, Coulson, and Emil Voss. It was the correct way to send it. Not a plea, not an argument. A formal request through proper channels with explicit acknowledgement that the decision was mine. I gave it to Petra. I said, "Send this to my lawyer. Tell her I need a response before I leave." Petra looked at the letter, then at me. She said, "Okay." I said, "Don't." She said, "I wasn't going to say anything." I said, "You were making a face." She said, "That's just my face." She went to call my lawyer. The response I sent back was 2 sentences. Paternity acknowledged pending DNA confirmation. All further contact through legal counsel at the following address. Emmett's reply arrived within the hour. It said, "Understood. Thank you." 2 words. No argument. I filed it and went back to the feeding schedule. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Coulson came to my room. He knocked. He waited. He came in when I said he could. He was not in his white coat. He had come at the end of his shift, the professional context deliberately set aside. He stood near the door with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the 3 boys in their shared bassinet, and he did not speak for a moment. I said, "You have 5 minutes before Petra gets back." He said, "I won't need 5 minutes." He looked at the babies. Sol was awake, processing the world with the focused attention he brought to everything. Ren was asleep. Rue was making the ascending sounds of someone building toward a complaint. "I owe you 9 months of things I cannot give back." "Yes." He moved to look at the boys in the bassinet before he said the next part. "I'm not going to try to explain the leaving tonight. That's not what this is for." "Then what is it for?" "I've been in this building for 3 days." He kept his eyes on the babies as he said it. "Not in your corridor, not pushing on anything. Just aware, every hour, that you were on this floor with 3 new people, doing it the way you did everything. Completely alone. Correctly. Without asking anyone for anything." He stopped. "I know what that cost, and I know it was my fault it cost that." I looked at him. "That's all. I'm not asking for anything." "Emmett sent a letter through legal channels," I said. Coulson turned from the bassinet. He said, "I know. That's Emmett." It was the right way to do it. Something moved in his expression. Not hope, too careful for hope. Something more provisional. "Come back when you have more than 5 minutes," I said. "Bring your brothers. Go through proper channels and we'll discuss what co-parenting looks like. But if any of you appear outside the agreed process, I will make this significantly harder than it needs to be." "Understood." He looked at the boys one more time. Then, "What are their names?" "Sol, Ren, and Rue." "Those are good names," he said. He left. I picked up Rue, who had completed his ascent to full complaint, and held him until he found what he needed and settled. I said to the room, "We are going to be fine." The room did not argue. The first 3 months were the hardest work I had ever done. This was accurate information, not complaint. I had prepared thoroughly. The apartment was organized for the reality of 3 infants. Systems were in place. Petra and Dax ran a rotation without being asked to. My parental leave had been arranged without negotiation because I had 4 years of work at the firm that made the conversation unnecessary. I had prepared for everything I could calculate. What I had not fully calculated was the 3 o'clock hour. Night after night, all 3 of them awake simultaneously, me moving between bassinets with the measured focus of someone running a process, and in the margins of that focus, the thing I refused to let be a thought, but that was there anyway, what this room would have felt like full. 3 alphas and 1 omega and 3 pups, the pack biology of it, the warmth of what should have been here. I did not let it be a thought. I returned to the work. The legal framework was established in the first month. My lawyer and the Voss legal team negotiated with the efficiency of two parties who had been given clear instructions. My lawyer to protect my position completely, the Voss team to accept whatever I proposed. The result was supervised visits, twice monthly, neutral location, mediator present, DNA testing, which was administrative rather than disputed all three alphas, one biological father per child, according to Pack Bond Convention. The DNA results confirmed what biology had already established. Emmett and Sol, Coulson and Wren, Emile and Rue. I filed the results and moved on. The first visit was when the boys were 6 weeks old. I brought them to the mediator's office. Hartley, the mediator, was a calm beta who had clearly handled complicated family arrangements before and was not destabilized by this one. He had arranged the room practically space for the pram, chairs at a table, nothing designed to force proximity. All three alphas were already there. Emmett in his civilian clothes, the controlled presentation he brought to everything, the suit jacket replaced by a dark sweater that made him look less like a chief of obstetrics and more like what he was underneath it, which was a man who was frightened and not going to perform being frightened. He stood near the window with his hands in his pockets and looked at the pram as I brought it in. Coulson sat at the table. He had the stillness of a physician at rest, not tense, just present, the specific quality of someone who had learned to be completely still in rooms where being still was required. Emile was near the far wall. He had lost weight since the delivery room. I noted this the way I noted structural changes, factually, without editorializing. He stood with the particular quality of a person who has decided that taking up less space is the correct approach and is executing it carefully. I said, "The rules are the same as in the legal agreement. This is their time. I'll end the visit if anyone upsets them or me. Questions?" No one had questions. Hartley facilitated. The visit was 40 minutes. The boys were too young for interaction in any meaningful sense. What it was four adults in a room with three 6-week-old infants and three alphas encountering their biological children for the first time in a context that offered them nothing except presence. Emile held Rue for the entire 40 minutes. He sat with Rue in his arms and did not perform anything. He held him with the attentiveness of a neonatologist. He had examined hundreds of newborns, knew exactly how they felt, what their weight distribution meant, what their responses indicated, but the attentiveness he brought to this was not clinical. It was the attention of someone holding something that mattered more than he had words for yet. Rue, 6 weeks old and already opinionated, looked at Emile with the focused assessment of a baby encountering a new person and found him acceptable. This was more than I had expected. When the visit ended and I was settling them back into the pram, Emile said, "Thank you." I said, "It's for them." He said, "I know. I'm still thanking you." I said, "Don't thank me yet. This is one visit. Visit 3. Emmett delivered his explanation. He had prepared it the linear, organized quality of a man who had written and revised something and was now presenting the final version. He talked about the decision he had made, the calculation behind it, the specific ways the calculation had been wrong. He talked about his mother's role in framing the situation, about his fear, about the failure of his own judgment at the critical moment. He was thorough. He was honest. He did not minimize. When he finished, I said, "I heard you." He said, "Okay." I said, "I don't have a response yet. I'll tell you when I do." He nodded once. He looked at Sol, who was on the mat doing the focused head lifting of a baby who had decided that neck strength was interesting and intended to develop it aggressively. He said, "Can I?" I said, "Yes." He sat on the floor beside Sol and did not demand anything. He just sat there, in his good trousers on the mediator's office floor, near his son, and was present. Visit 5. Emile had sent his paperwork correctly for each visit, fulfilled every requirement, communicated through Hartley. He had not come to visits 1 through 4. At visit 5, he appeared. He sat across from me at the table and looked at Rue and did not perform anything. I said, "You've been sending things." He said, "Yes." Over the 6 weeks since the first visit, packages had been arriving. A carrier I had mentioned to Petra in passing, difficult to source. A type of sleep sack with better temperature regulation. A developmental reference organized by week rather than month, which was how I thought about infant development and which I had never seen packaged that way. Each with a note that said only the item's name and where he had found it. I said, "The carrier is good. I use it every day." He said, "I'm glad. I'm not telling you that to encourage anything. I'm telling you because it's true." He said, "I know." He went to sit with Rue for the rest of the visit. At the end, he said, "I designed something. I won't show it to you now, but it exists." I said, "What did you design?" He said, "A house for 7 people. I won't show it until you ask." I said, "I might never ask." He said, "I know." The conversation with Coulson that I had been anticipating happened at visit 7, when Hartley took Emmett and Emil to discuss a scheduling matter and left us alone with the boys. Saul was investigating his hands. Wren was making the pre-complaint sounds I had learned to distinguish from genuine distress. Rue was engaged in his philosophical assessment of the ceiling. "Can I ask you something?" Coulson said. I said, "Ask." "Why didn't you call? When you found out, even if you expected what you got, why not call and say it?" "Because you had already made your decision." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. He said, "We made the wrong one." I said, "You made one, and I made mine." My decision was that the children were mine, and that anyone who wanted to know them would have to demonstrate they were capable of a different kind of decision than the one that produced the first. He looked at the mat where the boys were. He held that for a moment before he said anything else. "You've been in this hospital since the boys were born," I said. "Not in my corridor, not claiming anything, just available. I know because Colette told me, and because I could feel it through the bond." He looked up from the mat. He said, "The bond is still there." I said, "The bond doesn't switch off because you make a bad decision. You know that. It just goes quiet." "It's not quiet anymore." He said it without inflection. Just the fact. "I know it's there. Don't read it as an invitation." He held my gaze. He said, "I won't." Wren had been escalating steadily through all of this. The pre-complaint had crossed into something more decided. "Hold him," I said. "He's building to something." Wren had reached the decision point. Coulson picked him up with the efficiency of a physician and the care of a father, and Wren settled with the immediacy of a baby who had found what his biology was looking for. I watched this happen without saying anything. After a moment, "He does that for you," since the delivery room. "He hears your voice before he can see you, and he turns." Coulson looked at the baby in his arms. "He smells like you," he said quietly. "He smells like both of us. That's what the bond does with children." He said, "Yes. Don't read into it." "No." He held Wren for the rest of the visit. Month 3, I went back to work. Part-time first, then full, then past full, the structural review that had been waiting for me. A promotion that was presented as fait accompli when I returned. The specific velocity of someone resuming something they were built for after a period of necessary pause. I was good at my job. I had always been good at it. In the months since the pact dissolved, I had become formidably good at it. In the way people became formidably good at things when those things were among the few areas of life entirely under their control. The visits continued, twice monthly, and they were working. The boys at 3 months were beginning to respond to the people in their world in ways that were identifiable as preference. Sol tracked Emmett with the focused attention he brought to everything. Emmett was precise and systematic, and Sol appeared to recognize this as a quality worth observing. Rue reached for Emil. Wren turned his head when Coulson entered a room. I observed all of this without expressing anything about it. I observed the alphas, too. 3 physicians who had spent their professional lives learning to be present in difficult rooms were learning, with varying degrees of success, to be present in a difficult room that had nothing to do with medicine. Emmett had stopped explaining himself and started building understanding questions about the boys that showed he was thinking about them between visits, specific and informed. Emil arrived prepared, research evident, quiet in the way of someone who was paying attention rather than withdrawing. Coulson was warm and precise in the combination I had once loved and was now experiencing through the glass of maintained distance. I did not let the distance close. The bond stirred in the visits. I managed it the way I managed other physiological realities, by acknowledging it accurately and deciding, not yet. The boys knew warm and fed, and the sense of the people who came for them. They were content. I was building something. The shape was still emerging, but I was building it the way I built everything, from the foundation up, with the correct materials, according to plans I had drawn myself. Month 4. Emmett built something. I found out on a Tuesday morning when the building manager knocked on my door and handed me a key card and explained that the modification work on my floor was complete. He said the commissioning party had asked him to mention it was nothing structural, and then he added, with the air of someone relaying a message they did not entirely understand. He said to tell you he used the word structural specifically because he thought you'd appreciate it. I looked at the key card. The modification was the unused storage room at the end of my corridor converted into a dedicated nursery facility, soundproofed. Equipment storage along the left wall. A changing configuration that had been designed, I could see it immediately when I opened the door by someone who had thought carefully about how a person moved through a space with 3 infants. The storage was where you'd reach for it. The dimensions had been calculated for function rather than appearance. The countertop was exactly the right height. Someone had looked at a floor plan and thought about how I moved through it. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I called Emmett. He answered on the second ring. I said, "You put a nursery in my building." He said, "The stairs are 4 flights with no lift. 3 infants, 1 adult, daily. The injury risk alone." I said, "You didn't ask me." Silence. He said, "You're right. I should have. Do you want me to have it reversed?" I looked at the room. At the storage configuration, that was exactly what I would have specified. At the soundproofing, that meant the boys could sleep while I worked in the apartment. I said, "No, but you ask first. This is my home, Emmett. You don't make decisions about it." He said, "Yes, I understand." I said, "If it happens again, I'll have it undone regardless of whether it's useful." He said, "It won't happen again." I started to hang up. He said, "Milo." I waited. He said, "I know you don't want the explanation again. I'm not giving it again. I kept thinking about what it looked like. You, managing all of it, and nothing in the building making it easier. I wanted to make one thing easier. That's all it was." I said, "I know." He said, "Is that?" I said, "It's better than most reasons you've given me." He was quiet. I said, "Thank you for the room. Ask next time." I hung up. I stood in the new nursery for another minute and ran my hand along the countertop. Then I went back to the structural review that was waiting for me. Emil's packages continued arriving every 2 weeks. Never more than 1 item. Always the same format. The name of the thing, where he had found it, occasionally a brief practical note. Never sentiment. Never an appeal. A white noise machine with better frequency range than the standard kind. A carrying system designed specifically for multiples, which I had not known existed. A developmental reference organized by week rather than the standard monthly intervals, which was how I thought about infant development. I kept everything. I did not respond to the notes. At the 4th month's visit, after Emmett and Coulson had taken the boys to the playmat and Hartley was writing at his desk, Emil said quietly, "Have you used them?" I said, "The charts and the white noise machine, both." He said, "The charts are organized the way you think." I said, "I know. How did you know that?" He said, "From the way you talk about their development in the visits. You reference weeks, not months." I said, "You've been paying attention." He said, "I pay attention to everything about you. I always have. I just didn't act on what I knew when it mattered." I looked at him. He said nothing further. He had said the right thing, and he was letting it be what it was. I said, "Hold Rue if you want." He said, "I always want to. I always ask first." I said, "I know. It's a good habit." He went to Rue on the mat with the patient attentiveness of a man who had decided that being present without demands was the only currency available to him and had committed to spending it carefully. Coulson's request came through Hartley's system at the end of month 4. It said, "I am requesting a meeting outside the standard visit schedule without the children present. I am not asking in my capacity as a co-parent or as a physician. I am asking because I want to understand what the pregnancy was, the 9 months. I was present at the end and absent for all of it, and I need to understand what I missed. not to use it for anything, not to center my own guilt in it, just to know, if you're willing. I sat with it for 6 days. I sent back, 1 hour, coffee, neutral location, you talk for the last 10 minutes. The first 50 are mine. He sent, yes. We met at a coffee shop that had no associations for either of us. He arrived before me. There were 2 cups on the table, mine with oat milk. He stood when I came in, which was the kind of thing Coulson did, the small courtesies that came from how he had been raised and that I had once found endearing. I sat down. I said, I'm going to tell you what the 9 months were. You're going to listen without managing it or contextualizing it. When I'm done, you have 10 minutes. He said, yes. I told him. The week I found out, standing in my bathroom with a test in my hand, doing the math of what my life had just become. The first trimester, working through the nausea because there was no one to take anything from me, and no option of not working. The specific loneliness of coming home to a space that still carried the faint scent of 3 people who had decided to leave it. The night at 30 weeks, when my blood pressure spiked, I drove myself to the emergency room at 2 in the morning because there was no one to call. I sat in triage alone, was observed and cleared, drove home alone, and assembled the 3rd crib at 4 in the morning because I could not sleep and needed something to do with my hands. The week before the birth, the weight of 9 months of managing everything, arriving as exhaustion that had nowhere to go, packing the hospital bag alone. The first contraction in the hospital car park, leaning against my car door for 45 seconds before I could walk. I told him all of it without softening it and without making it about them. It was mine. I was telling it because he had asked correctly, and because I had been carrying it in a sealed container for 9 months, and the container had been making things heavier. When I finished, he sat with it. Then he said, the night at 30 weeks. Yes. Which hospital? His voice was careful. St. Agatha's, across the city. Coulson set his coffee cup down on the table. He said, I was on call at Meridian that night. I said, I know. He looked at the window. Not at me. At the street outside, the ordinary Thursday traffic. He said, you were 2 miles away. Yes, you're 10 minutes. He drew a slow breath and turned back. I want to skip the guilt because you told me not to center it. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment, then up. What I want to say is that I spent 9 months telling myself you were fine, that you were capable, which is true, and that capable meant fine, which is not the same thing. What you just described is not fine, not because you failed at anything, but no one should carry what you described alone. And I told myself a story that let me not think about it. What was the story? That I didn't deserve to come back until I'd figured out how to deserve it. That waiting was a form of respect. He said it flatly, without defense. It was a way of making my absence about my own process instead of about you. We sat with that. The coffee shop moved around us, someone ordering at the counter, a door opening to the street, the ordinary sounds of a place that had no history with either of us. Your 10 minutes are up. He said, I know. I stood. At the door I stopped. Ren turns his head when he hears your voice, I said. Before he can see you, he hears it, and he turns. Coulson did not speak. I'm not telling you that because it means anything yet. I'm telling you because you should have the information. I left. Outside, I stood in the autumn air with my hands in my pockets and thought 2 things simultaneously. I am still angry, and I am tired of carrying all of it sealed up. These were not incompatible. I filed both and went home. Month 6. Emmett called on a Wednesday evening. Directly. Not through Hartley. My mother called this afternoon, he said. What did she say? She heard about the co-parenting arrangement. She used the word complicated several times. She suggested a clean legal arrangement with minimal contact would be better for everyone. Then his voice shifted slightly, quoting attempting to rebuild something that has already demonstrated its instability. What did you tell her? That it was not her concern. A pause. I'm calling you because I made a decision before based on external input without consulting you. I won't do that again. I wanted you to hear this from me before you heard it from anywhere else. I said, she's the one who built the framework for why you left? He said, yes. She didn't lie to us. She presented real information in a frame designed to produce a particular outcome. I understood that about 3 months after I made the decision I could not unmake, and I have been living with that understanding since. What did you say to her today? That the pack bond exists, the children exist, and Milo makes the decisions about what happens from here. Not me, and certainly not her. I stood up and walked to the window. The boys were down the hall, asleep. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments were quiet, in the middle of an evening that had not expected to turn into this. I held the phone and looked at the street below. He said, I should have said that before we left. I know that. I'm saying it now because I want you to know I said it. Thank you for calling. Can I ask you something? You can ask. Why did you stay in the city? You changed firms, moved apartments, but you never went far. You were never difficult to find for someone genuinely looking. Why? I thought about it. Because I didn't do anything wrong, I said. I was not going to build a life around hiding from people who had wronged me. And because I knew that the children would eventually want to know where they came from. I wasn't going to make that impossible. I was going to make it require effort. It required effort, he said. Good. The street below was doing what streets did in the middle of the week, indifferent to the conversation happening above it. I waited before I said the next thing, because it required saying correctly. What you've become in the past 6 months is different from what you were when you made that decision, I said. I've been watching it. I'm not telling you what it means yet. I'm telling you that I see it. He was quiet for a long moment. That's more than I expected, he said. I know. Don't do anything with it yet. I hung up. I stood at the window for a while after, with the boys asleep down the hall and the city doing its indifferent work outside. What I had just said was true. What it meant was something I was not ready to decide. Month 7. Petra said, over dinner, you're different. I said, different? How? She said, less like everything is behind glass, like things are actually in the room with you now. I said, I'm not less angry. She said, I didn't say that. I said, less sealed off. The visits you come home from them differently than you used to. I said, they've gotten better at being present. She said, and you've gotten better at letting them be present. She picked up her fork. I'm not making a case for anything. I just noticed things. I did not argue with her. She was right that something had shifted. Not in my position, the children had fathers who were earning the right to be known by their children, and that was what was happening. But the quality of it had changed. Emmett had stopped explaining himself and started building knowledge questions between visits that showed he had been thinking, preparation that was genuine rather than performed. Emil had begun speaking more, the careful wall presence evolving into someone who offered observations, asked questions, had a very long and specific conversation about the structural properties of block towers that I found I was honest enough to acknowledge this genuinely interesting. Coulson, after the coffee shop, had settled into something more direct. The guilt management had relaxed into simple presence. He showed up to visits as himself, which was warm and precise and entirely focused on what was in front of him, and what was in front of him was Ren, and Ren turned his head every time. I observed all of this from my maintained distance. But I observed it. Month 8. I sent one message to all 3 of them on a Sunday evening, not through Hartley, their numbers, directly. Come to my apartment next Saturday morning. Bring nothing. Just come. 3 responses arrived within minutes. Emmett, we'll be there. Emil, yes. Coulson, what time? I sent the time and address, my real address, my home, and said nothing further. They arrived together on Saturday, which I had not specified but understood. They were a unit. Some things did not change. Petra let them in and left. The boys were in their room. This conversation needed to happen without them in it. I sat across from all 3 of them. I said, I'm going to say what I need to say. I need you to hear all of it before anyone responds. No one argued. They had learned, in 8 months of visits, when listening was the only correct thing to do. I said, you left. You made a decision about our pack without consulting me. You treated a bond as a logistics problem, calculated that leaving was the cleaner outcome, and executed the decision. You knew I was pregnant. You left anyway. I looked at each of them. I said, I want you to understand what the 9 months actually cost. I told Coulson some of it. You should all have the full picture, not as a guilt exercise as information. You should know the weight of what you chose. I told them, the same way I had told Coulson, without softening, without performing emotion. The emergency room at 30 weeks. The 3 cribs assembled alone at 4 in the morning. The specific texture of 3 o'clock feeds with no one to hand a baby to. The delivery room, 4 hours and 50 minutes of that, and then all 3 of them walking through the door because the universe had decided that was how this was going to happen. I watched them receive it. Emmett did not look away from me once. His jaw was tight and his hands were flat on his knees, and he took every word without deflecting. Coulson had heard some of it before. He sat with hearing it again, in front of his brothers, and it was not easier the second time. Emil looked at me the way people looked at things that had happened while they were somewhere else, the grief of someone who had not been present for something that mattered and could not go back. When I finished, I let the silence be for a moment. Then I said, "You have been showing up for 8 months, each of you differently, each of you consistently. Emmett, you asked before making decisions after the first time. Emil, you sent things that required paying attention to know I needed. Coulson, you asked the right question the right way and you listened to the answer. I have been watching all of it." I said, "The boys have 3 fathers who show up, who are getting better at it, who do not use them as leverage. That is what they need. It is what you are providing." I said, "And now I'm going to tell you what I've decided." They waited. I said, "You get the children, fully, properly, without the mediated structure, because you have earned that and because they deserve it. Whatever they need going forward, you are there for it. That is not conditional." I said, "You do not get me." I let that land. I said, "I rebuilt myself on the foundation of not having you. What I built is not available to be restructured around a bond I spent 9 months without. I am not the person who needed you anymore. That person spent 9 months becoming someone who didn't, and I am not willing to find out what happens to that person if I fold you back in." Emmett said, "Is that final?" Yes. He received it. One nod, the nod of a man who had been given clear information and was not going to argue with it. He looked at the table and left his hands where they were. Coulson said quietly, "I understand why. I'm not going to argue. I just want you to know I understand the reasoning and it's sound." Emil had not spoken. He had been looking at his hands through most of it. Now he looked up. "The house?" he said. "Yes." He shifted in his chair. "I keep drawing it. Every few weeks I revise it. It's different now than it was at the beginning, bigger, in the ways that matter." He paused, looking at the table again, then back. "I know you might never ask. I know what you just said. I'm telling you it exists because that's how you operate and I want you to have the information." I looked at him for a moment. "Roll up the plans," I said. "Put them in a drawer. If I ever want to see them, I will ask." He said, "Okay. I mean that as a possibility, not a promise. I'm being clear, not kind." He said, "I know the difference." I stood. "The boys are in their room. Go spend time with them. That's what Saturday is for now." I went to the kitchen. Behind me, I heard the sound of 3 men arriving at something solid, not what they had wanted, but something they could build from. The quality of an ending that was also a set of terms. A few minutes later, Sol appeared in the kitchen doorway, dragging his rabbit. He said, "Daddy, Emmett is building a tower wrong." I said, "Wrong how?" He said, "The base is too narrow." I told him, but he says his way is fine. I said, "Tell him a structural engineer taught you that a narrow base is the most common foundation failure mode." Saul looked at me with the focused interest of a child receiving useful data. He said, "What's a foundation failure mode?" I said, "When the bottom can't hold the weight of the top." He thought about it. He said, "Like when things fall down." I said, "Like when things fall down." He turned and ran back to the living room. I heard him say with full authority, "My daddy says narrow bases are foundation failure modes." A pause. Then Emmett's voice, unhurried, "He's right. Let me fix the base." I drank my tea. The months after that Saturday had a different quality. The mediated structure was replaced, at my initiative, with a direct co-parenting arrangement. Shared calendar, communication channel, a rotation that had developed organically from the original framework into something that fit the actual shape of our lives. The alphas came twice a week. Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings on rotation, one of them at a time. Sunday afternoons were mine, the boys, and me, not negotiable. It worked. more cleanly than I had anticipated. Emmett had stopped demonstrating and simply become present, the evolution of a man who had decided that showing up consistently was the practice, and practiced it. He fixed the block tower base. He texted once to ask whether Sol had mentioned swimming lessons, because Sol had said something at a Tuesday visit. I said yes, and Emmett enrolled him in the right program and sent me the schedule. Emil brought his sketchbook to visits. He drew the boys. He drew the apartment, the proportions, the light, the specific angle of the kitchen window where the morning came in best, which was an angle I had chosen deliberately when I arranged the furniture. I saw one of these sketches once. He had been paying attention to how I lived in my space. Coulson, on his Tuesday evenings, had developed a habit of staying after the boys were down to help close out the evening. He washed dishes with the focused efficiency of a man performing a task correctly, and we talked about the boys, about work, about the structural problem I was navigating at the firm, which he asked about because he had remembered I'd mentioned it the previous week. He was a good listener. He'd always been a good listener. I was aware of this. I was managing my awareness of it with the same precision I managed everything else, which was accurately and without commitment. One Tuesday, standing at the sink, Coulson said, "The partnership came through." I said, "Last week." He said, "Congratulations." Genuinely. I said, "Thank you." He said, "You built something remarkable. In 9 months, carrying everything at once, you built it from the beginning." I said, "I've been building from the beginning my whole life." He said, "I know. I'm saying I see it clearly now. Not because it means anything between us, because it's true, and you should hear it said plainly." I looked at him. I said, "Thank you." He went back to drying. The evening had the warmth of a space that two people have inhabited long enough to be comfortable in. My biology registered it. I held that awareness at arm's length and made no decisions based on it. But I didn't dismiss it either. The boys turned 4 on a Thursday. I had rented the community room in the building. 12 4-year-olds, organized chaos, cake with the specific structural instability of too many candles. I had arranged the logistics with the thoroughness I brought to organizational tasks, which meant the party was well designed and ran on schedule, which was not something most children's birthday parties could claim. All 3 alphas came. Emmett ran the structured activity with the organized authority of a man who had decided that birthday parties were a project requiring a project manager. The children listened to him, with a compliance they did not give anyone else, which made Sol visibly proud. Emil sat with the overwhelmed children, the ones for whom 12 4-year-olds was too much, and drew with them at the quiet table in the corner, showing a child how to draw a house with correct proportions, patient, focused, entirely himself. Coulson chased Ren around the room for 20 minutes, because that was what Ren wanted, and Coulson had the stamina for it, and the judgment to know that sometimes the right medical decision was to let the patient run. I stood at the edge of it and watched. My colleague Dax appeared beside me with cake. He said, "This works." I said, "It does." He said, "You built it." I said, "We all maintain it. I designed it." He said, "That's what I meant." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you happy?" I thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. I said, "I have a partnership at a firm I'm proud of. I have 3 children who are developing into people I find genuinely interesting. I have a co-parenting arrangement that functions and 3 men who show up for their children and respect the terms we established. I have my apartment, which is mine." I said, "Yes, I'm happy." He said, "No qualifiers?" I said, "No qualifiers." He said, "And them?" I looked at the 3 of them, Emmett explaining the rules of the next game with the seriousness of a man delivering a clinical briefing. Emil, who had produced his sketchbook and was now drawing the birthday scene around him, the children, the chaos, the room, all of it rendered in his precise architectural lines. Coulson on the floor with Ren on his shoulders, undignified and clearly fine with it. I said, "They are good fathers." Dax said, "And," I said, "and that's what I decided they would get to be. That's what they are." He looked at me the way old friends looked when they thought you were leaving something out. I said, "I'm still deciding some things. When I've decided them, I'll know. Until then, I'm here, and this is good, and that's enough." He accepted this because he knew me well enough to know it was the most honest answer I had. He handed me the cake and went to get his own. Across the room, Emil had turned his sketchbook so that Rue could see what was on the page. Rue, 3 years old and already his father's son, in the way he looked at things carefully, from multiple angles, with the patience to look twice, was tracing the lines with one finger. I crossed the room. Emil looked up from the sketchbook. He closed it, which was not something he usually did. He left drawings open, unfinished, available. He closed this one. "The house," I said. He said, "Yes. I'd like to see the plans." He held my gaze. His hands were flat on the closed sketchbook. "When?" he said. "When you're ready to show them." "I've been ready for 3 years." "I know. I wasn't. I am now." He nodded once, not extracting a promise from it, not performing relief. Just receiving the information for what it was, a door that had been kept closed, opened a fraction, by the person who had always held the key and was choosing, now, to use it. I went back to the edge of the room. Sol found me 10 minutes later. He pressed his face into my side and said, "Daddy, this is the best birthday." I said, "Is it?" He said, "All our dads are here, and you're here, and our friends are here." He looked up at me with his father's eyes in my face. "That's everything." I put my arm around him. I said, "Yes, that's everything." Outside the windows, the city was doing what it did on Thursday afternoons, indifferent and continuous. Inside, a 4-year-old had just accurately named what mattered, which was not a small thing. I had built this. Not alone, the boys had built it with me, and 3 men who had made a wrong decision and spent 3 years building toward a different kind of right had maintained it with me. But I had drawn the plans. I had specified what would hold. I had decided what the foundation required, and I had built it to those specifications, and it had held. That was not something anyone could take from me. The bond was there. It had been there for 3 years, quiet and present, a thread that biology did not dissolve just because the people on either end of it had made bad decisions. I was aware of it the way I was aware of load-bearing elements in a building, not constantly, but when I paid attention, and with respect for what it could and could not do. What it could do was carry weight. What it could not do was replace the decision about whether to let it. That decision was mine. It had always been mine. I had made one version of it on the Saturday of month 8, and I was, now, 3 years later, in the process of making another one, not the same one. A different one, built on a different foundation, one that had been tested over 3 years and had not failed. I was an engineer. I knew the difference between a structure that had not been tested and one that had held. I was deciding what to do with what had held. On my timeline, with my hands on the plans,